He was Australia's most wanted man, but tonight Hakan Ayik is behind bars in a Turkish prison. Ayik, who's accused of running a global drug empire, was sensationally arrested in Istanbul, where he'd been hiding out since fleeing Sydney more than a decade ago.
A gangster so slick, so cocky, and so good at hiding that it takes over a decade to track him down. But he's not just any criminal. He's Australia's most wanted man, the mastermind behind a drug empire that's smuggling massive quantities of illegal substances into the country. His name, Hakan Ayik. But to most people, he's known as the Facebook gangster because of his bizarre choice to taunt the police from behind his social media accounts. Let's rewind a bit. Ayik didn't just pop up out of nowhere. He didn't start his life as a hardened criminal. In fact, he's like a character straight out of a crime thriller. Smart, resourceful, and a bit too cocky for his own good. He worked his way up the criminal ladder in Australia by being incredibly clever with his connections and his business moves. And soon enough, he was running one of the most powerful and dangerous drug cartels in the world. But here's the twist. Despite being a wanted man for years, Ayik was always a step ahead of the police. And when he realized he couldn't hide in Australia anymore, he moved his whole operation overseas. Now, if you're thinking he hid in some quiet rural part of the world to lay low, think again. He set up shop in Istanbul, Turkey. Not exactly the first place you'd think of when you imagine a safe haven for a wanted criminal. Yet, there he was, living the high life in the city's buzzing streets, hidden behind a flashy facade. The King's Cross Hotel in Istanbul became his fortress. Sounds like the perfect cover, right? But here's where things started to go wrong for Ayik. He got arrogant. And that arrogance, combined with a bit of laziness, left him with a trail of clues that eventually led the authorities straight to him. But before we get to how they found him, let's dig into Ayik's rise to power. It didn't take long for him to become a household name in the underworld. In fact, his first big break came in 2008 when he was linked to a massive drug bust at Jandakot Airport near Perth, Australia. Police intercepted a small plane carrying around $7 million worth of drugs, methamphetamine and ecstasy tablets to be precise. This wasn't just a small-time bust. It was the biggest drug seizure in Western Australia's history. And surprise, surprise, it was connected to Ayik. Back then, Ayik wasn't the big name he would later become. He was just another up-and-coming figure in Australia's underground criminal scene. At first glance, he seemed to fit the typical profile, Middle Eastern, possibly linked to one of the various crime groups that had been circling Australia for years. But something was different about him. While many criminals worked their way up by being brutal or violent, Ayik had a business mind. He wasn't just selling drugs, he was creating connections. And those connections would be the thing that took him from a local player to an international criminal mastermind. His most clever move? Partnering with the Chinese Triads, one of the world's most powerful and secretive criminal organizations. This opened up an endless supply of drugs that Ayik could push into Australia. And that wasn't all. He also teamed up with Gangster Guru, an enforcer for one of the notorious Beaky gangs, the Comancheros. Together, they formed an almost unstoppable force. Ayik didn't just have the drugs, he had the distribution network in place too. By 2010, Australian federal agencies were convinced that Ayik was behind a massive chunk of the drug trade flooding into the country. But Ayik wasn't an easy target. He was constantly slipping through the cracks, managing to avoid capture time and time again. But just when the police thought they were about to close in, something happened. Ayik disappeared, gone, just like that. He vanished, taking his entire operation with him. He moved overseas and, for the next several years, was practically untouchable. He relocated to Turkey, a country that had become a perfect hiding spot. Why? Because it wasn't just geographically removed from Australia, it was also a place where Ayik could blend in. He wasn't just hiding out like a regular fugitive. He was living a lavish lifestyle. Think expensive cars, private jets, luxury holidays, you name it. For a guy who had been making millions of dollars through drug trafficking, why wouldn't he live like a king? But here's the thing about criminals who live in the lap of luxury. They sometimes get a bit too comfortable. Ayik, in particular, didn't even try to be cautious when it came to covering his tracks. He made some huge mistakes, and as we'll soon find out, these blunders would prove to be his downfall. It wasn't just his careless online activity that caught the attention of authorities. It was his growing arrogance. For someone who had been able to stay out of sight for so long, he started to taunt the police. One of the ways he did this was through social media. While most criminals are careful not to leave a digital footprint, Ayik did the opposite. He used platforms like Facebook and Instagram to show off his wealth and success. Little did he know, this would be the thing that ultimately gave him away. At one point, authorities managed to find a public Instagram account linked to Ayik's wife, Fleur Messelink. She posted photos from luxury holidays and high-end cars, which caught the attention of investigators. Through further digging, they found out that Fleur was married to a man who was, in fact, Hakan Ayik, except he was using a new name, Hakan Reyes. That's right. In his arrogance, Ayik had gone as far as to change his name. He didn't think he would ever be caught, but the clues didn't stop there. Investigators found photos, videos, and even wedding pictures that placed Ayik in the very place they had been tracking, Istanbul. In fact, they even found footage of him inside his hotel, and there was no mistaking it. That was Ayik. His elaborate ruse was crumbling fast. So, what does this mean for Ayik? Is he about to be caught? Well, there's still a long road ahead, but with the web of evidence tightening around him, his days as a free man are numbered. But before we get into how the authorities finally closed in on him, let's take a look at just how much power and influence Ayik's cartel has. And believe me, that's where things get even more intense. Let's take a look at the bigger picture. What exactly was Ayik running, and how did his rise to power lead to the creation of what's now known as the Aussie cartel? Spoiler alert, it's a lot bigger, more dangerous, and way more sophisticated than you might think. If you think about it, Ayik wasn't just a drug dealer. He was the head of a multinational criminal empire, a global network of gangs, cartels, and shady connections. This wasn't some ragtag group of petty criminals. This was an international syndicate with fingers in every illegal pie imaginable. And it was all organized by Ayik, who, like any savvy business tycoon, knew that connections were everything. In this world, it's all about building relationships, and Ayik's network spanned the globe. But before we go into the nuts and bolts of his empire, it's important to understand just how Ayik's Aussie cartel came to be.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Tonight we take you inside the hunt for Australia's most wanted criminal. He's a rat-cunning, ruthless gangster who's made an eye-watering fortune importing massive quantities of drugs into Australia. Law enforcement authorities call the criminal network he helps run the Aussie cartel. But as you'll see, after years outwitting the cops, his arrogance could soon be his downfall. We've managed to link top-secret intelligence with multiple online clues, including some remarkably careless Facebook and Instagram activity, to discover this crook's secret hideout.
The story goes way back to the early 2000s when Ayik was still making a name for himself in the drug game. At this stage, he was already involved in smuggling drugs into Australia, mostly methamphetamines and ecstasy. But as he started to grow more confident and his operation expanded, Ayik needed to find new sources and more reliable ways to get his goods into Australia. And that's where things get interesting. Rather than relying on the usual local criminal routes, Ayik reached out to some of the world's most powerful crime syndicates. We're talking about the Russian mafia, the Chinese triads, and the Mexican cartels, groups that have been dominating the global drug trade for decades. These aren't small-time operations. These are criminal empires that span entire continents and control everything from drug production to distribution networks. So, how did Ayik manage to secure such powerful allies? Simple. He had connections, and he knew how to make deals. His ability to bridge the gap between all these different gangs and criminal organizations is one of the things that set him apart from other drug lords. It wasn't just about selling drugs. It was about orchestrating a massive international operation. This wasn't a one-man show. It was a network of criminals working together for mutual profit. What Ayik managed to do was bring all these gangs under one roof, creating a criminal syndicate that had you at global reach and deep pockets. And the Aussies? Well, they were the key players in this network. The Aussie cartel was essentially a syndicate made up of Australian criminals who had formed their own supergroup by partnering with these international players. It wasn't just about Australia anymore. It was about a global criminal network with Australia at the center. Now, here's the thing about criminal empires like this. They need to be run like businesses. And for Ayik, that meant having a steady supply of drugs, an efficient distribution system, and, most importantly, connections to corrupt insiders. You can't run an empire like this without having a way to get your product through customs and into the hands of your buyers. Enter the corrupt insiders, or what the police call doors. A door is a person who works within the system, someone on the inside who is willing to look the other way, or even actively assist in moving illegal goods through airports, ports, and shipping containers. These insiders are the lifeblood of Ayik's operation, and they helped ensure that even if the authorities were closing in, his shipments would still get through. Ayik didn't just rely on luck or happenstance. He invested time and resources into making sure he had the right people in the right places, and it paid off. It wasn't just about drugs either. Ayik's cartel was involved in money laundering, illegal gambling, and even human trafficking. The scope of their activities was vast, and their operations were so sophisticated that they could almost run themselves. But while this may sound like a well-oiled machine, there was one big thing standing in the way of Ayik's empire continuing to thrive: law enforcement. Australian authorities knew that Ayik was behind a massive chunk of the country's drug trade, and they weren't about to let him run free forever. But Ayik wasn't the only criminal mastermind out there. There were other gangs, other crime bosses, and other players who were competing for control of the market. In fact, Ayik wasn't just the kingpin of his own empire. He was part of an ongoing battle for dominance within the Australian underworld. There were constant rivalries, turf wars, and betrayals happening in the shadows. But Ayik was different. He wasn't just about power and territory. He was about making sure that his operation kept growing and expanding. And to do that, he knew he had to stay a step ahead of the police and outsmart his competitors. This meant that he had to constantly adapt his tactics and build even more relationships with people who could help him stay in the game. Now, let's talk numbers. It's estimated that the Aussie cartel was responsible for around a third of all drug importations into Australia. That's a huge chunk of the market. And with their global network, the cartel was raking in billions of dollars every year. Imagine the kind of resources they had at their disposal. We're talking about the kind of money that buys influence, the kind that can silence those who stand in your way. And yet, despite all their power and resources, the authorities were closing in. The Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, ACIC, had made it their mission to take down the Aussie cartel and all its key players, including Ayik. But how do you catch someone who's always one step ahead? How do you infiltrate a global network that stretches from Australia to Asia to the Middle East? Well, it wasn't easy, but the authorities were getting smarter, and they had one thing that Ayik couldn't control: time. As the ACIC ramped up their efforts, they started to track Ayik's movements and get closer to finding out just who was behind the Aussie cartel. This wasn't just a battle between the cops and the criminals. It was a war of attrition. And while Ayik thought he was untouchable, the walls were closing in. In the next chapter, we'll take a deeper look at how law enforcement finally managed to get their hands on critical intel, and how they started making moves to break up the Aussie cartel once and for all. But for now, know this: Ayik's empire was crumbling, and the day of reckoning was fast approaching. Hakan Ayik's criminal empire, the Aussie cartel, was a beast, global, well-funded, and slick. But no matter how well planned his operation was, there was always one thing he couldn't control: the authorities. And after years of pulling the strings in the shadows, Ayik's luck was starting to run out. The Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, ACIC, had been quietly watching Ayik and his cartel for years, but it wasn't until they started focusing on his international connections that they began to see cracks in his armor,
giving him access to an endless supply of drugs. What does that tell us about Hakan Ayik back in 2008-9? A young up-and-comer, he looks like all the other Middle Eastern crooks and barkeys, and yet he has the nous to reach out and form ties with what was then the biggest drug trafficking syndicate in our region.
Law enforcement knew they had to play this carefully. Taking down a network as sprawling and secretive as Ayik's was no easy task. But slowly and surely, they started piecing together the puzzle. One of the key turning points came when authorities started digging into the encrypted communications that criminals like Ayik were using. Encrypted phones, also known as cipher phones, were becoming a huge problem. These untraceable secure devices were the go-to for criminals who didn't want their messages intercepted. Imagine a regular phone call, except no one, no cop, no intelligence agency could listen in. It was a godsend for criminals like Ayik, who used them to stay one step ahead of the law. The hunt for Hakan Ayik and the Aussie cartel is a relentless global effort involving law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. Despite his vast network, wealth, and ability to evade capture, the walls are slowly closing in. As authorities track his financial moves, monitor encrypted communications, and collaborate internationally, Ayik's criminal empire is under increasing pressure. The pursuit is far from over, but the determination of global law enforcement means that one way or another, justice will eventually catch up with him. The stakes are high, but so is the commitment to dismantling his operations. As we continue this journey, we'll see how these efforts unfold and how Ayik's days of evading the law may finally be numbered.